The dense canopy of the Appalachian forest loomed over Tim, Sarah, and Jake as they trudged through the mud, their boots slipping in the sodden ground. The air was thick with the earthy scent of wet leaves, and the distant rumble of thunder hinted at the storm's approach. Their earlier laughter and chatter had faded into tense silence as dark clouds rolled in, signaling a storm. What was supposed to be a serene weekend escape quickly turned into a battle against the element. "Let's set up the tent here," Tim suggested, pointing to a flat area half hidden by overgrown bushes. His face was set with determination, though a flicker of concern was evident in his eyes. "Before the rain gets worse." Sarah glanced at the sky, her expression clouded with apprehension. "Are you sure this is a good spot? It looks like it could get really muddy." "We don't have much time," Jake interjected, his voice already raised to be heard over the growing wind. "We need to get out of this weather." The trio worked quickly, their movements growing increasingly frantic as the first drops of rain began to fall. The tent's poles were set up with hurried, almost frantic motion, and their fingers fumbled with the stakes as the drizzle turned into a torrential downpour. The wind howled, bending the trees and whipping the rain into a frenzy. "Tim, tighten that corner," Jake shouted, his face drenched as he struggled to secure one side of the tent. "It's going to blow away if we don't." Within minutes, the tent was barely anchored when the storm hit with full force. Rain hammered down in sheets, the wind howling like a beast unleashed. The noise was deafening, and the world outside seemed to dissolve into a blur of gray. "Let's split up to gather firewood and supplies," Jake proposed, shouting over the roar of the storm. His face was set with determination, though his eyes betrayed his anxiety. "Sarah, you check that way. Tim, you come with me." Tim nodded, casting a worried glance at Sarah as she headed toward the stream. The dense foliage shielded them from the worst of the downpour. The ground was treacherous and slippery, each step a battle against the mud. "Stay safe," Tim called to Sarah as they disappeared into the trees. Tim and Jake struggled through the downpour, their attempts to gather firewood becoming increasingly futile. The rain turned the forest floor into a slippery quagmire. The trees loomed ominously, their branches groaning under the weight of the water, casting eerie shadows that danced in the dim light. "Let's hurry up," Jake said, his voice tight with urgency. He stumbled over a hidden root, barely catching himself. The tent's not going to stay dry forever. They found a few branches but were soaked to the bone, their clothes sticking to their skin. The wind howled through the trees, amplifying the eerie sensation that something was lurking just beyond their vision. The rain fell in relentless torrents, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the forest in stark, frightening detail. As they made their way back, the ground beneath them suddenly gave way with a sickening crunch. Jake's eyes widened in shock as a sudden surge of water from a flash flood roared beneath them. He lost his footing and was nearly swept away by the rushing current. "Hold on," Tim yelled, grabbing Jake's arm with a desperate strength. He managed to pull Jake back. The intensity of the water forced them to retreat, their attempts to salvage their precarious footing nearly in vain. Meanwhile, Sarah was at the edge of the stream, struggling to find dry wood. The water was rising rapidly, swirling with a ferocious intensity. Her eyes darted around nervously, and a loud crack made her freeze. A massive tree branch, dislodged by the flood, crashed into the water nearby, sending a wave crashing over her and soaking her to the bone. Back at the tent, the wind howled, and rain pounded the fabric like a relentless drum. Tim and Jake stumbled back, their arms laden with firewood. Their faces were grim, their bodies shaking from cold and exhaustion. As they approached the tent, they noticed Sarah's spot was empty. "Sarah!" Tim shouted, his voice breaking with worry. "Where are you?" Panic set in as they realized Sarah had not returned. Their attempts to call out for her were swallowed by the wind and rain, the storm's fury amplifying their growing fear. "What if she got lost?" Jake's voice was strained. "We need to find her." After what felt like an eternity, Sarah finally staggered back to the tent, her movements unsteady and her clothes dripping with water. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her shivering form seemed almost ghostly in the dim light of the tent. She said nothing about what had happened, instead collapsing into the tent with an exhausted sigh. "Dara?" Tim asked, his voice trembling. Are you okay?" Sarah simply nodded, her eyes staring blankly at the ground. The coldness of her body made Tim and Jake uneasy, a gnawing discomfort settling in their chests. "We need to get a fire going," Jake said, trying to focus on something practical. "We need to dry off and warm up." Tim and Jake worked to get the fire started, their hands shaking as they fumbled with wet matches and kindling. Fire sputtered and crackled, its weak light barely dispelling the shadows that danced on the tent walls. As the night wore on, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Sarah's silence was unsettling. Eyes remained distant and glazed over, as if she were trapped in a world of her own. Tim and Jake tried to keep the fire going, but it was a losing battle against the dampness that seemed to seep into everything. A chill ran through the tent, making them shiver despite the feeble warmth of the fire. The wind howled outside, its mournful wail mixing with the eerie creaks of the tent. Strange noises emanated from beyond the thin fabric. Whispers carried on the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig seemed unnaturally loud. "Did you hear that?" Tim asked, his voice tinged with fear. He stared at the tent's walls as if expecting something to burst through. Jake nodded, eyes wide. "It's probably just the storm," he said, though his voice betrayed his unease. "We've been out in this weather too long." But as the hours passed, the sounds grew more distinct. Footsteps trudging through the mud, rustling leaves, and a low, mournful wail that seemed to pierce the night. Sarah's eyes flickered open briefly, her gaze fixated on a spot in the corner of the tent, her breathing shallow and erratic. "Sarah, are you all right?" Jake asked, voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah's gaze remained fixed, and she shook her head slowly, as if struggling to understand something beyond their perception. The next morning, the storm had abated, leaving the forest eerily quiet. The sky was a dull, oppressive gray, and the once bustling forest was now a silent, haunting expanse. Tim and Jake decided to search for any trace of Sarah's earlier whereabouts, their hearts heavy with a growing sense of dread. As they ventured towards the stream, the silence was occasionally broken by the distant call of a bird or the rustle of leaves. Jake stumbled upon a sight that made his blood run cold. Sarah's lifeless body, wedged in a crevice by the water's edge, her face contorted in a final expression of terror. What is this?" Jake gasped, mind racing as he stumbled back, face ashen. Tim approached, his face paling as he recognized the unmistakable signs of death. "She's been dead for days," he said, horror-stricken. His voice trembled, and he could barely bring himself to speak the words. We've been with a ghost." Jake's mind raced as he struggled to process the horrifying truth. He could hardly breathe as the reality sank in. They had been living with Sarah's ghost, unaware that she had been dead for days. The realization was almost too much to bear, each second feeling like an eternity of torment. "What do we do now?" Jake's voice was a whisper, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. Tim's eyes were distant, his face set with grim resolve. "We need to get out of here," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We need to leave this place." As Tim and Jake trudged back to the tent, the oppressive weight of their discovery hung heavily in the air. The storm had finally ceased, but a new storm brewed within them, one of dread and fear. The forest, once a refuge, now felt like a tightening noose around their throats. Their breaths came in ragged gasps as they entered the tent, seeking solace from the chilling truth they had just uncovered. Inside the tent, the temperature seemed to plummet further. The fire, now nothing more than a feeble flicker, did little to dispel the encroaching cold. Shadows danced grotesquely on the tent walls, elongating and twisting with every gust of wind outside. Tim and Jake exchanged uneasy glances, their minds still reeling from the sight of Sarah's lifeless body by the stream. Suddenly, the air grew colder still. The dim light from the fire cast an eerie glow, and a spectral presence began to take shape. Sarah's ghostly figure appeared before them, face pallid and her eyes hollow, like two empty voids staring into their souls. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying, her presence filling the tent with an unearthly chill. "Sarah?" Jake's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "What do you want from us?" Sarah's ghost remained silent but extended a translucent hand, fingers beckoning them. The gesture was unmistakably clear. She wanted them to follow. Fear gnawed at their resolve, but a morbid curiosity compelled them to follow her spectral form. They ventured out into the forest, their every step crunching through the sodden leaves and mud. The once familiar woods seemed alien in the dim light, shadows twisting into menacing shapes as the canopy overhead swayed with an unseen wind. As they followed Sarah's ghostly form deeper into the forest, trees seemed to close in around them. The darkness grew more profound, the only illumination coming from the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the ghostly apparition. Their hearts raced, each crack of a branch or rustle of leaves making them flinch. Sarah led them to a rocky outcrop, a jagged formation of stones partially obscured by overgrowth. The area was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the forest reduced to an unsettling silence. Tim and Jake exchanged anxious glances, their fear escalating with every step. "Why are we here?" Tim asked, his voice barely audible. "What's happening?" Jake's eyes widened as he noticed something peculiar about the rocks. His breath caught in his throat as he saw what lay within the dark crevice, a sight that made his blood run cold. The bodies of two people were wedged in the narrow gap between the rocks, their forms twisted and contorted. Their faces, though pale and lifeless, bore the unmistakable signs of death. Wide, unseen eyes and expressions frozen in terror. The sight was a ghastly reflection of their own fears, and the realization hit them like a physical blow. "No, this can't be." Jake's voice faltered, his face turning ashen as he recognized the familiar features of their own body. Tim stumbled back, his legs weak as he tried to comprehend the horror before him. "This is us. We're dead?" he gasped, mind struggling to grasp the impossible truth. The weight of the realization bore down on them, crushing force that left them immobilized. The forest seemed to close in further, trees now pressing against them like an inescapable prison. The ghostly figure of Sarah hovered nearby, her gaze filled with an empty sadness, as if she too were trapped in this nightmarish reality. In the midst of their terror, Tim and Jake understood that their entire experience had been an unending nightmare. The accident that had claimed their lives had also bound their souls to this forest, eternally haunted by the twisted reality of their death. As they stared into the faces of their dead selves, the forest around them seemed to become a living entity, dark, suffocating, and unyielding. The once comforting canopy of trees now felt like a shroud, suffocating them in their perpetual state of dread. The ghost of Sarah, now a tragic emblem of their shared fate, hovered as a constant reminder of the inescapable horror they were doomed to endure. In the chilling silence that followed, Tim and Jake came to terms with their fate. The haunting truth was inescapable. They were forever bound to the forest, trapped in an eternal nightmare, their souls forever haunted by the specter of their tragic accident.